SpaceX announced on Friday that the company is targeting mid-November for the second flight test of the Super Heavy rocket and its Starship upper stage. The second flight test of a fully integrated Starship could launch as soon as mid-November, pending regulatory approval, the company said on X. So, how SpaceX addressed this challenge? Will there be a second test flight of Starship coming in November? Stay tuned as we dive into this and more in today's episode.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of my channel.
Yes, finally, we've got an update on how the legal side of things is progressing. Early in the week, they sent this statement to users subscribed to the newsletter regarding commercial spaceflight. But there at the top, the confirmation that we were all waiting for, that they have completed the safety review part of the license evaluation. So far, only that and not the environmental part, but this is still a great step. This particular part of the review analyses possible risks to the public, as well as any risks to the physical property during the flight and re-entry of both the Starship and the booster. With that, their disposal at the ocean sites after they soft spoosh down on a specific target. So, yes, as confirmed by the FAA, all eyes are now on the Fish and Wildlife Service as they continue to work through their biological assessment. The FWS also looks to have been packing up at Starbase, hinting that their review is close to being complete as well. Just hours before rendering out this video, SpaceX announced that their second flight of a fully integrated Starship could launch as soon as mid-November. SpaceX will again target a morning liftoff for the rocket, perhaps around 8 a.m. local time in South Texas, 14:00 Universal Time Coordinated. The flight timeline and profile released by the company on Friday for the second flight test is similar to April's test, calling for a 90-minute flight of the Starship upper stage, which is intended to nearly complete a full orbit before splashing down into the Pacific Ocean near the island of Kauai. One notable change is the addition of a hot staging ring between the Super Heavy booster and the Starship upper stage. This technique will call for the Starship's Raptor engines to ignite before the upper stage separates from the Super Heavy first stage. This is more technically challenging than waiting for stage separation, but will eventually result in a higher payload-to-orbit capability for Starship. SpaceX will not seek to recover either the first or second stage on this flight. The goal, instead, is to prove the flight capabilities of the Super Heavy rocket and, if the stack reaches separation, the performance of Starship. Musk has said he thinks there is about a 60% chance that Starship will reach its destination on this flight. To know that right or wrong, SpaceX still said the launch date is pending regulatory approval. Those regulatory hurdles surrounding the fully reusable launch vehicle are now mainly centered around the conclusion of an environmental review, which is in the hands of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Earlier this week, the Federal Aviation Administration said it had concluded the Starship Super Heavy safety review. In a statement, the agency said the environmental review is the last major element to complete before the FAA makes a license determination. SpaceX will debut a number of upgrades to both the rocket itself, as well as the launch infrastructure, including their new hot stage separation system and an electronic thrust vector control (TVC) system. The FWS has been evaluating one of the key upgrades since IFT-1, the water-cooled steel flame deflector aka the water deluge system. Reached for comment early Friday morning, an FWS spokesperson said they didn't have any updates to provide regarding their progress. As was the case with the IFT-1 mission earlier this year, NASA has been eagerly watching the progress of Starship. SpaceX only has so much time to move through the evolutions of Starship before it's needed to operate as the first vehicle that will be a part of the Human Landing System program. Within the overall Artemis program. During 2024, SpaceX is expected to demonstrate its ability to transfer propellant from one Starship vehicle in orbit to another, a key milestone needed within the architecture of safely getting the spacecraft to the Moon, down to the surface, and back into lunar orbit. In contrast, SpaceX is different. They have the technical capability to ready Starship for launch at any time. However, they're hindered by another factor, which is part of the government agency. This seems to be a complex issue that's persisted throughout the testing and development process of Starship. There's always some degree of tension between companies and regulators in almost any industry. That tension can be healthy as both companies and government agencies seek the right balance between ensuring safety and allowing progress. There are signs though of strains between the launch industry and the United States and its main federal regulator. Changes in launch regulations intended to streamline the process may have done the opposite, slowing down licenses as companies seek to expand their launch activities. At the forefront of those tensions is SpaceX. The company is preparing its Starship vehicle for a second test flight but needs an updated launch license from the FAA to do so. Although the FAA recently announced that they have completed the safety evaluation during the Starship and Super Heavy license assessment. However, this does not automatically grant SpaceX a launch license. The FAA is currently engaged in the environmental review process, including consultations with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services about the environmental effects of the new water deluge system SpaceX has installed on their pad. That's designed to prevent the serious pad damage seen in the first launch, but Fish and Wildlife has to examine what impacts that system might have on the environment. A Fish and Wildlife Services spokesperson said that once it receives the FAA's final biological assessment, it has up to 135 days to review it. That piece is a little bit of a wild card. Kelvin Coleman, the FAA's Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation, said, but was optimistic it wouldn't take nearly that long. We're hoping that piece will wrap up somewhere in proximity to the safety review. Clearly, the scheduled launch date for Starship in the first week of November is off the table. However, the work continues and the efforts this month remain a cause for concern as SpaceX closely collaborates with the FAA and undergoes the investigations by Fish and Wildlife. In recent times, we have seen Fish and Wildlife Services officials consistently entering the Starbase facility after each SpaceX test of the water deluge system to assess the environmental impacts around the launch site. There are still no signs indicating when the results of this assessment will be concluded and the scheduled Starship launch dates approaching closely. To be honest, from all that Starship has to contend with, we can also observe the stringent regulations imposed by the U.S. government on space activities. This may impede the progress of ambitious missions and their technological advancements. In fact, SpaceX is not the only company facing challenges with regulations. Other companies have run into the problems with a new streamlined launch licensing regulation called Part 450, which took effect in 2021. The regulations were a response to calls by the industry with the backing of the Trump administration through Space Policy Directive 2 to make it easier to demonstrate meeting safety requirements through performance-based standards. Rather than more prescriptive protocols, that has not worked out in practice, at least so far. Karen Chenoweth, president of CS Consulting and a former executive with SpaceX and Relativity Space, noted that only 4.450 launch licenses have been issued to date and at least 2 of them exceeded the 180-day review period by the FAA established by law. Recent changes in the FAA regulations have not resulted in streamlined licensing reviews, she concluded. Instead, Part 450 has proven more cumbersome and costly. While well-intentioned, the Part 450 effort has not succeeded in accomplishing the streamlined process, Bill Gerstenmaier, Vice President of Construction and Flight Reliability at SpaceX and a former NASA official, noted in his prepared testimony. AST's ability to process licenses in a timely fashion has declined rather than improved, indeed, as evidenced by licensing for the handful of applicants under Part 450 approval timelines are not improving. Wayne Monteith, a former FAA Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation, said in his testimony that the result to develop the Part 450 regulations may have contributed to the problems implementing them. Based on the short development timeline, industry involvement in the regulatory process was severely limited, he wrote. Because of this compressed schedule, some constructs within Part 450 were not as thoroughly vetted as would have been ideal. That's further complicated by an increase in launch activity that's straining AST's workforce. Difficulties in implementing Part 450 regulations only exacerbate this workload, said Phil Joyce, Senior Vice President for the New Shepard Business Unit at Blue Origin. The problems with Part 450 extend beyond launch to re-entries, which are also covered by regulations. Vardes Space Industries has been working with the FAA for months to get a license to return a capsule on its first satellite, launched in June to test technologies for pharmaceutical production and microgravity. That license, the first Part 450 re-entry license, has not yet been issued. Jillian Asparoff, co-founder of Varda, said in an interview last week he could not say if the company would have already gotten a license under the old regulations. The company also has to work with the Utah Test and Training Range to identify when that Air Force Run range can now support a capsule landing. I feel confident that if there had been 10 previous Part 450 re-entry operations, it would have gone much more smoothly, he said, with the licensing process. Witnesses were unified in their call for additional resources for AST to allow them to hire more staff. Gersten Meyer argued for doubling the budget of AST. Currently, less than $38 million a year provided the additional resources go into handling licensing. He warned of dire consequences if regulations aren't approved and more resources are allocated to AST. But as AST transition licenses for vehicles previously approved under legacy regulations to Part 450 over the next 2 years, the entire regulatory system is at risk of collapse, he wrote in his prepared testimony. AST's workload over the next 12 to 24 months could result in the grounding of U.S. space launch capability if action is not taken immediately. Any increase in AST's budget would be welcome news to Coleman. The first thing we focus on, and we have a big focus on this during the course of the past year, is really trying to make sure that we have the requisite staff on hand, hiring and bringing the talent pool in that we need in commercial space to keep pace with the industry, he said. He attributed the issues the industry had with Part 450 to the growing pains of new regulations. It's not only challenging on the government side, but on the industry side as well, he said. The transition to Part 450 will last until 2026 when all existing licenses under old regulations have to convert to Part 450 licenses. As we get more experienced and as more companies get more experienced, I expect us to really see the full benefits of Part 450 come to the forefront and see some nice games from that, you said. That tension though about regulations and the speed of licensing will continue for some time. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk has publicly complained about the slow pace of licensing at the FAA and posts on the social media network X, which he acquired last year. Coleman though noted in an interview last month that after those comments, Musk visited FAA headquarters to discuss Starship licensing, meeting with him and FAA leadership. It was a good conversation, he said. I think the relationship's working pretty well, but there are some challenges of course that we have to work through from time to time. Even Musk said as much. In fairness to the FAA, it is rare for them to cause significant delays in launch, he posted last month. Overwhelmingly the responsibilities are. Well, if you like this video, make sure to give a thumbs up, and subscribe. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching. By the way, are you familiar Ipa-toktok Philippines app? Ipa-toktok is a delivery service app designed to connect more people by delivering items door to door. For more information, download the Ipa-toktok app, here down below.